Hello everybody and welcome to EA Sports WRC, a game that's been taking up quite a lot of my free time recently, and today I'll be showing you all a Classics Showdown. Now this began, as most of my play sessions do, by heading into the time trial mode, because much like life, the time trial mode truly is like a box of chocolates. You don't know which car you'll be driving around Peltola today. Bruh. But on this particular day, the game offered me something different. I was offered a time trial on the Central European Rally stage of Libosvary. And on this day, it gave me a Vauxhall Nova with which I would have to try and beat the other player's target time. Now this being my first attempt, it was pretty scruffy, with a few small off-road excursions. It was not the tidiest of runs at all. There was quite a lot of mistakes and I dropped a lot of time. I also learned very quickly to not bother touching the handbrake. Touching the handbrake is a very bad idea in this car. But what I found quite early on was the stage had quite a good mix of slow speed technical uphills and then some really fast sections which really make you feel like a hero. And what's more, the backdrop of the stage with the forests and the open plains really was quite spectacular to look at, and it really was an enjoyable stage to play through. Now it became clear very quickly that the high speed sections are where you can gain a lot of time on this stage, and it was really the section that allowed me to beat the target time. However, conversely, the big braking zones at the end of these high speed sections were where you could also lose yourself a lot of time, so you had to be quite careful with how you judge that braking. And then the final three splits of the stage have a long uphill with some rather slow feeling corners. It's very easy to overdrive this section, which can quite often lead to you falling off the road, as our unfortunate test subject will demonstrate. No. And then the final split of the stage is the one last test of commitment. High speed corners into a downhill, where it is very easy to bin yourself and end your run in a very spectacular crash. But to be honest, it was the perfect way to top off this stage. It was a very fun and enjoyable stage, it was challenging, and it really does make you feel like a hero when you get it right. Now, as I alluded to earlier, straight away I'd beat the target time the game had set. But as I'd enjoyed the stage, I wanted to look a bit further into it. A quick check of the leaderboard showed that this was good enough for 35th in the world, but I was a minute off of the top time. But as you'll have seen, this run was scruffy, so there is a ton of room for improvement on this stage. Another thing that was quite interesting was that of the top 35 times, there were only 2 players that did not use the Vauxhall Nova, and those were both using the Mini Cooper. And this was quite unusual. Perhaps the Nova was indeed the best car, or perhaps players were just being recommended this car the most and hence the top times all used it. So given that I was still fresh on the stage, it seemed like a good time to start experimenting. Especially because the first split and 2 of the later splits have long uphill sections where surely having a lot of power will help. Now in the H2 category there are 3 cars available. You've got the Vauxhall Nova, which I just used, the Mini Cooper and the Lancia Fulvia. Of these, the Fulvia had the most power, which surely was going to pay dividends in the uphills. And this seemed to be true. Right away I was gaining a lot of time on my previous best, just in the first split alone. The extra power did seem to be helping. Admittedly, the longer wheelbase and the extra weight of the car did mean it felt less agile, especially in the high speed sections. It kind of felt almost a bit boaty compared to the Vauxhall. But it did have one extra benefit, which is in that first split, there are a few corners where you can just make small cuts which can help you straighten the corner and gain a bit more time. The Lancia felt very planted in these cuts. The Nova, as soon as you start getting a little bit off the road, it gets very light and very slidey, whereas the Lancia you could take a bit more of these cuts, and it just helped you gain that little bit more time in this uphill. Now it's worth noting that when I play this game, I use a standard PlayStation 5 controller. And one of the things I did notice whilst driving the Lancia was it felt like it gave me so much more feedback through the controller. Like I said, the Vauxhall felt very light when you got off the road, and generally at higher speed sections, I couldn't quite judge it as well. But the Lancia, as soon as you start pushing the limit, you can sort of feel the car start to slide, and it just meant that I was understanding more of what the car was doing within the game. And so that just made it a lot more enjoyable to drive, because it also meant that I knew when I felt like I was close to the limit. You could just feel that slide starting to happen, and it really did make you feel like a hero. So immediately, this car was very fun to drive, as well as so far being quite fast compared to my previous best time. And the run overall was a little bit cleaner than my Vauxhall run. I did still have some pretty big mistakes which cost me quite a bit of time, especially in the high speed sections, but it was a little bit cleaner and it allowed me to improve my time, moving myself up to 31st on the leaderboard. And the Lancia had felt great to drive, but the improvement overall was a little bit underwhelming because I'd made quite a lot of mistakes in that first run with the Vauxhall. So I thought, well, there's 3 cars in this category, I might as well give them all a good try. The next car to try was obviously the Mini, which did have the main benefit, which was it was the lightest car in the category. So whilst it may not have the power, it may still have a good place in the uphills because it doesn't have to accelerate as much weight. Now, the short wheelbase of the car meant that it was very agile. This thing felt like a go-kart in the slow corners, and it was very responsive when you tried to turn into a corner. However, with it being very lightweight, it meant that I just wasn't feeling feedback through the controller again. It was worse than the Nova in that respect. So whilst it did have that really high agility, I never really felt like I could make use of it. And because I wasn't really feeling this feedback or understanding how close or far away from the limit I was, it led to some pretty big crashes.
Slight right, long. And slight left, 60.
Yeah, I do feel kind of bad. The Mini is one of the best cars of all time, and I have not been treating it well. And after a big crash like that, I kind of needed to start from scratch again. Now the next run started well. Again, I'd made some small driving improvements over my previous run, which gained me a bit more time in the uphill. But again, I still was not able to adjust to the feedback the car was or wasn't giving me. And it just meant I kept overshooting braking points, and on the straight sections, as much as it pains me, this car just got left for dead. And because of that, I was making more and more driving errors. On the next attempt, I overtook my personal best time, but even with the Lancia at that massive disadvantage of momentum, I was bleeding time in the high speed sections, to the point where at the beginning of the uphill, my personal best was right behind me again. I continued to overdrive trying to push, and I joined our unfortunate friend from earlier. Like I said, the car was incredibly agile, but I just could never make use of it. I couldn't quite judge where the grip was, and I just kept overdriving it and throwing it off the road, which was really sad to see. I did give this car a number of attempts, but I just could never get anywhere near the time I'd set in the Lancia. So after struggling in the Mini for a while, I thought it was best to go back to the Vauxhall Nova. Whilst my driving was still pretty poor, my understanding of the stage was a lot better. I was starting to recognise more of the corners and knowing where could I push and where should I hold back a little bit more. On the uphill, I could see that my personal best in the Lancia was definitely gaining time on me in that first split. But immediately after the uphill, there were a couple of medium to high speed corners, and the Nova just felt planted here, and it meant I could carry so much more speed and gain so much time on my personal best. And it was in these corners where I could feel the extra agility that the Nova had, and it was nowhere more noticeable than in split 3. There was this small corkscrew section, and the Nova was so easy to drive through this. The Lancia felt like you were constantly having to force it into the corners, whereas the Nova just sort of glided from one to the next. It meant you could carry so much speed, which was vital because it led into a very high speed section. So if you mess up the corkscrew corner, you're going to be bleeding time for the next 20 seconds. And after the first 2 splits, I gained 1.2 seconds despite losing ground in the first uphill. By split 5, I'd gained 14 seconds on my personal best, partly because I didn't go off the road like I did in my personal best, so obviously maintained a lot more momentum, and so would have gained a lot of time by not having that mistake. And in the twisty uphill, I gained yet more time. The short wheelbase of the car was a dream here, and it almost felt like a go-kart. You had some power, but you also had very good cornering. So I was just able to gain yet more time, to the point where I was heading into the final split 20 seconds up on my personal best. It was all looking good, until...
4 right, short over crest, into 6 right, very long, slowing, 50, unseen, square left, 30.
That was a pretty big crash, but even with it, the run was good enough for a 14.5 second improvement on my personal best, which then got me into the top 20 times. And this run was enough to show me that the Nova, at least for me, is by far the easiest of the 3 cars to drive. In the high speed sections, it just feels planted, and it's very easy to also use in the twisty sections because how agile it is. But I still wasn't getting that feeling of feedback. For the most part, this didn't really matter. I was still able to gain speed just because the car was easy to drive. But it was difficult to know how hard I was pushing it. I couldn't judge whether I was close to the limit or not, because as soon as I went over the limit, the car just went light and spun me around, and I couldn't quite judge that line. So the Lancia definitely still had some potential. Now that being said, I did, out of curiosity and also of necessity to actually get the thumbnail for this video, because I'm so good at foreplanning I forgot to look at the replays last time, have one last attempt in the Mini. It was unfortunately a scruffy and unspectacular run. I was just having to sit there watching my Ghost get further and further ahead. As much as I love the Mini as a car, I am just not able to drive it quickly on this particular stage. And so it was then time to return back to the Lancia, because the enjoyment of driving it and just that allure to try and set a good time in a car which was nowhere on the leaderboards was just that much more tempting. And I was still convinced that the time I could gain in the uphills because of the increased power would just pay dividends in the overall stage time. In my attempts, I was generally gaining between 1.2 to 1.6 seconds in the first uphill, but the Nova's speed in those medium to high speed corners meant that it instantly ate up that advantage, so I was instantly playing catch up into the downhill. And I wasn't happy about this. I needed to capitalise on that advantage in that first split, so I started pushing harder, and it led to a lot of big crashes.
Titans. Opens and tightens. Through junction. Into big crest. 50. 5 left. Don't cut. Into 4 right over crest. Into 4 left. And 4 right. Into 4 left. 50.
It is painful to watch a car as gorgeous as this get treated this way, but it was all part of the learning process of trying to understand the stage, this car, and where I could be pushing and where I really needed to back off. But despite making a lot of big mistakes, the time improvements were noticeable, whereas previously I was getting left for dead after those 2 right-handers. I was now keeping up with the Nova to the point where I could actually start to overtake it heading into the end of split 2, holding the lead nearly to the first hairpin corner. I was starting to learn the corners which I could take flat out and really starting to push more on the faster corners, which was so much fun. I've not had another feeling in this game like it, because you can just start to feel the rear slide, you can do a bit of counter steering, and if you just get it where you're just perfectly staying on the road, just avoiding dipping a wheel into the dirt, it is so satisfying. And it was honestly, I was just whooping for joy. It was so enjoyable to drive in this section. But no matter how much I was enjoying driving the car, I was still struggling to beat my personal best time. And it was confusing. A clean run should have been all that it would take to beat that time. I made a huge crash at the end of that run. But the problem was I was just bleeding time up until that final split. And by the end of the uphill, I was 14 seconds behind my time in the Nova, which meant that even though I had a clean run, it was still slower than my personal best, which had a huge crash. This was pretty disappointing, but there was clearly still a lot of time to be gained if I pushed harder in the 3rd and 5th splits, where there was a lot of flat out driving and corners that lead onto it. If I could just gain that bit more time and not be left behind by the Nova, I could still beat it. All I needed to do was stick with the Nova, and I'd be able to beat that time hands down. However, as my overall driving on the stage had improved, I did need to give the Nova another try and just make sure that pushing the Lancia was really going to be worth the effort. And I was able to find a lot of time. I was gaining seconds on my best run, even before I got to the split where I crashed. However, even in the Nova, pushing this hard does come with its risks. I found the braking for this long left-hander in split 3 regularly was catching me out. It was really easy to just try and push it a little bit harder and then just understeer off the corner. And the final high-speed turns had so much time to be found, but an even greater capacity to just end your runs. If you get these corners wrong, you are falling off the road and doing many barrel rolls, so it was really difficult to judge. And what's more, with it being in touching distance to the finish, it really was a hero or zero section of the stage. What's more, even the first high speed section, which I'd driven many times by this point, was still enough to claim a few of my runs. However, again, despite these mistakes, I'd learned a lot as well. I'd learned that these double right-handers in split 2 can be taken flat out as long as you turn in at the right time, which helps snowball speed all the way down the next downhill. And then the long left-hand turn in split 3, which had been catching me out, partly because I'd been turning in too late. I was having to teach myself to turn in a lot earlier than I thought I'd have to, and it was really helping me just carry so much momentum through the corner. And then the corkscrew later on in that split was so vital to gaining speed on the flat out section. But in the Nova, you could take it flat out, again, by just turning in that bit earlier and just being a bit more aggressive with how you enter the corners. And these changes alone helped me gain 4 seconds on my personal best just in these first 3 splits. By the time I was entering the final split on this run, I was 8 seconds faster than my personal best. But once again, those last few high-speed corners caught me out. I was not learning my lesson and had another fairly spectacular crash. But thankfully this was a faster crash than last time, which allowed me to still make a 10-second improvement on my personal best. It was still an immense improvement on my previous best time, but I just couldn't escape the feeling that, again, the lack of feedback I was feeling with this car, making it that bit harder to push, and it was perhaps the thing that contributed the most, if you ignore the glaring lack of talent, to that crash in the final few corners. The Nova was clearly capable of so much more, but the Lancia was just so much more fun and enjoyable to drive. It was so much more exciting because I could feel that grip. But of course, all the improvements I've made had only moved the benchmark further away, and the result was the crashes weren't getting any smaller.
Into big crest, 50. Short over crest, into 6 right, very long, slowing, 50.
Even the close calls were enough to end runs because it just allowed my best time in the Nova to just run away. The corners where I'd just been starting to push in the Nova felt like an absolute knife edge to try and minimise the time loss in the Lancia, which was just leading to a lot of repetitive and quite frustrating mistakes. But the splits were actually showing a different side to the story. Yes, I had just thrown away a run where I was tantalisingly close to my personal best, but this meant that my splits in the Lancia were the fastest they'd ever been. Before, I'd been losing 7 seconds in the first 3 splits alone, and the losses just kept piling up by the end of the stage. But now I'd managed to reduce the losses to roughly 2 seconds in the splits where I was slower, and with a fair bit of time on offer in the first and last splits, it was surely still game on to set a new personal best. My following attempts were showing yet more promise, remaining within 0.6 of a second after the corkscrew, a section where I'd previously been losing seconds. By the end of split 5, I was still within 2 seconds of my personal best. As I was entering the final split, I was within 4.5 seconds. But unfortunately, another run was ended in those last few turns, but this time actually turning in too late. I tried in vain to try and keep it going, but the run was over. And with another successive failure, the frustration was beginning to set in. The next run I was slower and overdriving, and it led to an unceremonious exit from the stage. But the run that followed this was fast. For the first time I managed to hold the lead going into split 3, and I had one of my best runs through the corkscrew, allowing me to stay within 0.3 of my personal best. A solid split 4 and 5 meant that going into the uphill, I was still only 2.5 seconds off my personal best in the Nova, and by the beginning of the final split, I was within 4 seconds of the personal best. This was the chance I've been looking for to finally improve my time. I just needed to keep it planted in those last few corners. But then, as I entered the downhill, a thought started to enter my mind. This could be a great run, but could it be better? What if I fully sent those last few corners maximum commitment to not just beat my time, but just destroy it? Wouldn't this just be the best finale for this car on this stage?
70. 6 right, over small jump, 60. 4 right, short over crest, into 6 right, very long, slowing, 50.
I was gutted. I could not believe it. I'd thrown away 2 PB runs on the same corner, and at this point I needed to take a break and actually decide if I wanted to continue. When I did return, I opted to finish the stage just so I could rewatch the replay of it and just see what did the run actually look like. And I was amazed. Watching the car dance across the road and glide through the high-speed corners was just majestic. It was so nice to watch. I couldn't believe how far I'd managed to push this car since I started driving this stage. I'd gotten so lost in just trying to beat my personal best, I'd forgotten how much that I'd actually just improved at driving on this stage. There was still plenty of time to be found, but I'd also gained so much more up to that point. But what's more, no one in the top 30 was using anything other than the Nova. To be even pushing for a top 10 time in the full view was awesome in its own right. So when I sat down for my next runs, I was a lot more relaxed. I wasn't frustrated by mistakes. If I went off the road, I just accepted it, remembered the point that I'd started from, and just kept going until I finally got my chance. It was by no means the fastest run I'd had, but it was the chance I'd been looking for, and surely it was about time I'd learnt my lesson.
1 left, opens, and slide right, very long. Tighten 6. Into 6 left, slowing, 50. 1 left, tightens, and square right, 80. Long crest, and 3 right, 90. Bump, 60. 4 left over crest, 50. 6 left. Tightens 5 over crest, 140. Brake. 4 right, through dip, 70. 6 right, over small jump, 60. 4 right, short over crest, into 6 right, very long, slowing, 50. Unseen, square left, 30. Open hairpin right, 50. Slight right, slowing, 70. 6 left, and 4 right short, over finish, and 3 left to stop. Okay, that's an 8-minute 28.5.
Finally, I had beaten my personal best time. It wasn't an earth-shattering improvement, but those 1.3 seconds allowed me to finally sit top 13 and be the only full viewer around. Now I've absolutely no doubts that better players are going to come along and beat my time. And you know what? I look forward to seeing how far they can push this stage and how fast they can go in these cars, because it is so much fun. For me, this stage has a great character. The uphills require you to be quite patient and just not pushing too hard. And yet, the high speed sections, you can go full commitment. And even if you're not pushing for a best time, you still get those moments where you feel like a hero. Maybe you took a little bit more speed than you expected into a corner and you get a little bit of opposite lock. It just feels so satisfying and enjoyable. And with the scenery around the stage, it makes for some great replays to rewatch. And the 3 cars I was trying in it had great characters of their own. The Mini, whilst it wasn't for me, was a very agile car and really did feel like a go-kart. If you want to set your absolute personal best time, the Nova will serve you very well. But for me, if you want to just have the absolute most fun and enjoyment of this stage, the Lancia cannot be topped. When you get that car on the limit and you get it dancing around these corners, it is so much fun, and hopefully I'll have convinced some of you to use it. But I do hope you have enjoyed this video. It was really fun to be playing through this stage. I will be taking a break from this stage for a bit. I think it's time that I actually went back to enjoying driving this stage rather than pushing it. And if any of you set times that you're happy with, or you just had a moment on this stage that you enjoyed, feel free to leave that in the comment section down below. I look forward to reading them all. But anyway, I've been the guy with no gamer tag, and I'll see you on another video.